Under the bright light of a quiet New York evening, a famous restaurant called the Meridian shines like a precious gem in the heart of the city. Here, shiny jade rings line up in front of the door, and guests in suits and silk dresses are exquisitely tailored, exuding luxury and class. Inside, the crystal cluster light reflects through the glass door, creating a poetic scene. The main door of the restaurant gently opens and a tall figure appears, setting a password for all eyes. That person is none other than a customer named Michael Reed. He is over 7 feet tall, walking slowly, confidently but without an account. In complete contrast to the noble diners, Michael is only wearing a simple gray t-shirt, comfortable sweatpants and old sneakers. His simplicity stands out in the spacious setting, like the mysterious depths of a lively music. Michael chose a small, discreet table in a corner, trying not to attract further attention. The shimmering light from the chandeliers above cast a warm glow over the space, adding a sense of quiet elegance. But before he could even place an order, a waitress with an air of superiority approached him. Her gaze swept over his outfit with clear disdain, and in a voice laced with condescension, she uttered words that sent an uneasy ripple through the room. "Are you sure about this? This is a fine dining establishment. Are you sure you can afford to dine here?" Her sharp words, dripping with contempt, were loud enough for nearby diners to hear. However, what unfolded next would not only leave everyone in the restaurant stunned but also reveal a truth that completely transformed the atmosphere. At the Meridian, where fashion and elegance were personal declarations, Michael Reed's simplicity was a stark contrast. Near the entrance, diners stole glances at him. Some recognized him as a basketball icon, a legend who had once dominated the sport. Yet, in the formal and polished atmosphere of the Meridian, his casual appearance seemed out of place. A quiet ripple of murmurs began to move through the tables. Behind the reception desk stood Emily, a young waitress dressed impeccably in a crisp uniform. Her hair was swept up into a flawless bun, with not a strand out of place. Her smile was polished and professional, but her eyes betrayed a subtle arrogance. Emily had spent years working at one of New York's most prestigious establishments, and she took great pride in her position. However, that pride often led her to form quick judgments based on appearances. When Emily's gaze fell on Michael, her displeasure was unmistakable. Her eyes scanned his casual athletic attire, and she raised an eyebrow with a subtle but judgmental expression. She thought to herself, someone like this doesn't belong here. Though merely a waitress, Emily often saw herself as a gatekeeper of the Meridian's sophistication. In her mind, guests needed to meet a certain standard, one defined by their attire, demeanor, and perceived status. The towering man standing before her, dressed in a simple gray t-shirt and worn sneakers, didn't fit her expectations. She doubted he could afford even a single dish on the menu, let alone blend into this world of refinement. Unfazed by the curious glances or Emily's veiled disdain, Michael approached the reception desk with a warm smile. His deep, steady voice carried a tone of calm politeness as he said, "Good evening. I'd like to book a table if one is available." Emily hesitated, momentarily caught off guard by the politeness in his tone. But her sense of superiority quickly reasserted itself. With a smirk and a condescending tone, she replied, "Good evening. Are you sure you'd like to dine here?" "Good evening," Emily said, her tone laced with thinly veiled mockery. "But this is a fine dining establishment. Are you sure you want to eat here?" Michael met her gaze directly, his calm, light smile unwavering. "Yes," he replied with a steady voice. "I'd like to try dining here." Emily rolled her eyes slightly but managed to maintain a superficial air of professionalism. "All right," she said curtly, "let me check the table availability. Please wait a moment." She turned away, but her mind was already racing with judgmental thoughts. This guy won't last long here. Let's see how he reacts when he sees the menu prices. Michael Reed, who had faced enormous pressure countless times in his life and career, stood calmly, unbothered by the subtle hostility. His steady demeanor as he observed the lavish ambience of the Meridian only heightened the curiosity of those around him. The golden light of the chandeliers illuminated his composed and confident expression, making him appear completely at ease despite the unspoken tension in the room. Tonight, Michael had stepped into a world of glitz and glamour, a world where appearances often dictated worth. Yet he didn't belong to it. Or perhaps he was there to challenge the rigid prejudices that shaped this very world. Emily returned from the reception desk, carrying herself with barely concealed arrogance. She had worked at the Meridian long enough to believe she was the gatekeeper of its elegance, an ultimate authority on the class and sophistication the restaurant represented. In her eyes, Michael, with his simple tracksuit and calm demeanor, was an oddity, completely out of place. "Are you sure you want to eat here? This is a fine dining establishment," she repeated, her tone dripping with mockery. Her gaze lingered on Michael's worn sneakers before finally settling on his face, her smile a thin mask of disdain. Her voice was loud enough for nearby diners to overhear, further adding to the uncomfortable tension. Michael, well-versed in handling judgmental stares and dismissive remarks, simply smiled, his calm expression never faltering. His unshakable composure stood as a quiet but powerful challenge to the assumptions being made about him. Michael, accustomed to judgmental looks and dismissive words, simply smiled. He met Emily's gaze squarely, his eyes steady and unwavering. "Yes, I'd like to try the experience here," he replied, his voice calm and polite. His composed demeanor rendered her sarcasm almost meaningless. But Emily was undeterred. She tilted her head slightly, her lips curving into a half-smile as if determined to make him uncomfortable. With an exaggerated grace that bordered on theatrical, she turned and spoke over her shoulder, "Follow me. I'll find a seat that suits your style." You are listening to a story from the YouTube channel Soul Deep Stories. Don't forget to leave a comment and share your feelings. Emily led Michael through the vibrant heart of the Meridian, where tables were impeccably set under the warm glow of crystal chandeliers. The diners exuded sophistication and confidence, engrossed in lively conversations. Yet Emily didn't stop at any of these prime spots. Instead, she continued walking, leading Michael toward the farthest corner of the restaurant. The lighting in this area was noticeably dimmer, and the atmosphere felt far less refined. Emily stopped at a small table near the kitchen, where the faint clatter of dishes and lingering food aromas disrupted the otherwise elegant ambience. Turning around, her face plastered with a forced smile, she said, "This spot should match your style perfectly," before dropping the menu onto the table with a light but deliberate thud that drew glances from nearby diners. Michael nodded without a hint of irritation. He sat down, his smile unfaltering, his eyes calm as though nothing happening around him could disturb his peace. Emily, however, wasn't satisfied. She wanted to see him flustered, embarrassed, or, better yet, walk out altogether. But Michael's serene demeanor, unshaken and composed, only seemed to frustrate her further. A hint of irritation flickered in Emily's sharp blue eyes as she turned briskly on her heel, her heels clicking against the polished oak floor. But before leaving the table entirely, she leaned slightly over her shoulder, her voice cutting through the soft chatter of the nearby diners. "Hope you enjoy this seat," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm, loud enough for others to hear. "Not everyone gets such a prime spot." Her remark lingered in the air like an unwelcome guest. Nearby diners exchanged hushed whispers, their gazes darting toward Michael Reed's corner table. A few sympathetic glances were cast his way, while others merely looked on, intrigued by his unwavering calm. At a table in the center of the softly lit dining room, an older couple sat observing the scene. Mr. Carter, his silver hair gleaming under the amber glow of the chandeliers, took a measured sip of his Cabernet before leaning toward his wife. "He's remarkably composed," he murmured, his voice low and thoughtful. "Most people wouldn't let that slide." Meanwhile, at the hostess stand, Emily's lips curled into a self-satisfied smirk as she stole another glance in Michael's direction. To her, the issue was already resolved. There was no way someone like him would remain in a place as sophisticated as the Meridian. Yet, as she basked in what she saw as a quiet victory, an odd unease began to ripple through the restaurant. Michael, though he had said little, was leaving an impression no one in the room could easily ignore. It wasn't just his imposing presence or the understated confidence he exuded, it was the quiet grace with which he carried himself. Tonight, the Meridian was about to become more than just an upscale dining destination. It was on the brink of becoming the stage for an unforgettable lesson in humility. Emily lingered a few steps from Michael's table, her sharp gaze flicking toward him like a predator calculating its next move. The subtle digs, the out-of-the-way seat, none of it seemed to faze him. To her, that only made the game more interesting. She turned back toward him with the menu clutched tightly in her hand, steadying herself, ready to push things further. With the leather-bound menu in hand, Emily approached Michael's table deliberately, her slow, measured steps drawing the attention of nearby diners. Placing the menu in front of him, she leaned in slightly, her gaze sweeping over him with a mocking edge. "Would you like me to explain the prices?" she asked, her tone deliberately condescending. Her manicured finger tapped on the corner of the menu where the restaurant's most extravagant dish was listed. "The most expensive item here is $350, she emphasized, enunciating each word as her eyes locked onto Michael's face, searching for any sign of hesitation or discomfort. Michael, steady and composed like a mountain facing a gentle breeze, remained entirely unshaken. He simply looked up, his eyes sparkling with a hint of quiet amusement. "I'll have the filet mignon Rossini," he said, his tone calm and casual, as though he were ordering a simple cup of coffee. For a brief moment, Emily faltered, her composure slipping as she processed his nonchalant response. She hadn't anticipated that he would select the priciest dish with such ease. Quickly recovering, she let out a derisive laugh, loud enough to turn a few heads at nearby tables. "Oh really?" she replied, her voice syrupy sweet but tinged with thinly veiled scorn. "I hope you can appreciate it. This isn't the kind of food everyone is accustomed to." Around them, murmurs began to ripple through the restaurant. A young couple seated at a neighboring table exchanged whispers. "She's so rude," the woman said, shaking her head. "Why would she talk to a customer like that?" The man beside her frowned. "She probably thinks he can't afford it." Emily, seemingly indifferent to the growing disapproval from a few nearby guests, stayed by Michael's table, her hand lightly resting on its edge as she awaited further reaction. But Michael simply smiled, his demeanor as calm as ever. "Thank you for the suggestion," he said, his polite tone almost disarming. "I'm looking forward to trying it," Michael said, his polite and steady voice carrying a hint of warmth. His composed response unsettled Emily. In her mind, this tall man, dressed in casual sportswear and worn sneakers, couldn't possibly understand the true value of such a luxurious dish. Yet, without realizing it, her demeanor and actions had already exposed her own pettiness and lack of professionalism. As she turned away, Emily deliberately raised her voice, addressing a nearby colleague. "Filet mignon Rossini, huh? He probably doesn't even know what he just ordered." She chuckled mockingly before adding, "People like that usually pick the most expensive item just to show off. But wait till the check comes, I bet he'll leave right away." Though seated, Michael could feel the weight of every gaze in the room directed at him. Some diners looked at him with sympathy, while others were simply curious. Yet Michael showed no signs of embarrassment or discomfort. Instead, he calmly opened the menu, skimming through the other dishes with an air of genuine interest, as if he were merely enjoying a culinary adventure. From the service counter, Emily continued to keep an eye on him. A flicker of irritation crossed her face at her inability to unsettle Michael, but at the same time she felt a twisted sense of satisfaction, believing she had asserted her superiority over someone she deemed out of place in the world of the Meridian. However, from a corner table, Mr. Carter, a distinguished older gentleman, observed the scene intently. Turning to his wife, he murmured, "He's testing everyone's patience here. It's fascinating." The atmosphere in the restaurant grew quieter, but the undercurrent of tension was unmistakable, like a spark waiting to ignite. The evening sky began to turn golden as Michael Reed sat quietly, his demeanor calm like a still lake. He wasn't just savoring the ambience of the Meridian, but seemed to be preparing for something much greater, a secret that neither Emily nor the restaurant could foresee. Emily turned away, a mocking smile still lingering on her lips as she approached the service counter. She leaned in and whispered to her colleague Liam, who was checking the reservation list, "He'll leave as soon as he sees the bill. People like him just pretend to be fancy. Look at what he ordered, the most expensive dish, and he doesn't even seem to know what he's doing. I bet he won't even make it to dessert." Liam, a young man with a friendly face, briefly glanced at Michael, who sat calmly in the far corner, unbothered like a mountain amid curious stares. He whispered back, low enough for only Emily to hear, "Maybe he's just here to enjoy the experience." Emily scoffed, shaking her head. What reasons could he have? Just look at him. Who comes to this restaurant wearing worn-out shoes if not to pretend to be someone else? Liam avoided her gaze, unwilling to argue. He felt uncomfortable with her behavior but knew that any opposition would only fuel her arrogance. At the corner table, Michael sat quietly, completely unfazed by the murmurs behind him. He leisurely flipped through the menu, as if savoring every moment in the luxurious setting. Curious glances occasionally drifted his way from nearby tables, but Michael met them with a gentle, untroubled smile. At a neighboring table, an elderly couple, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, observed everything with keen interest. In the silence, Mr. Carter, a distinguished-looking man with silver hair, slowly raised his wine glass. His eyes gleamed with understanding as if he had witnessed countless similar stories. Lifting his glass slightly, he gave a subtle nod toward Michael, a small but meaningful gesture. Michael caught his gaze and returned the nod with a smile, his eyes conveying, "I'm fine, thank you." Mrs. Carter leaned closer to her husband, whispering, "It's strange how they're treating someone like that." "Who do you think he is?" Mr. Carter set his glass down, his eyes still fixed on Michael. "There's something special about him, that calmness. It's not something everyone has." Across the room, Emma continued her commentary with Jake, but this time she wasn't keeping her voice down. It was loud enough for a few nearby diners to hear. "Look, he doesn't even have a reservation. People like him just want to see if they can sneak in unnoticed. But I guarantee he'll bolt the moment he sees the total on the bill." A few diners at nearby tables glanced at Emma, their disapproval beginning to show on their faces. In another corner, Lisa, a young businesswoman dining with a friend, frowned slightly. She turned to her companion. "She's being so rude. He hasn't done anything to deserve that." Her companion, a composed young man, nodded. "It seems like his very existence annoys her." The atmosphere in the restaurant started to shift, but not in the tranquil way that Lumiere was known for. Emma's words, the quiet observations of the other diners, and Michael's unshakable calmness created an underlying tension. Meanwhile, Michael continued to enjoy his moment, refusing to let the whispers affect his mood. Though he knew he was being judged, Michael felt no need to justify himself. At the Carter's table, Mr. Carter sighed softly, his gaze still resting on Michael. "The world is a strange place," he said, his voice warm but tinged with disappointment. "People forget that someone's true worth isn't in their appearance." Mrs. Carter nodded in agreement, but both of them understood that the evening's drama was far from over. Emma might think she was in control of the situation, but it was clear that in this room, Michael's mere presence commanded the atmosphere. After hearing the rumors, Emma decided to take her pride to a whole new level. In her mind, Michael didn't deserve the courteous service that Lumiere was known for, at least not from her. Turning her back on him, she grabbed her notebook and began attending to other tables as if Michael didn't exist. She stopped at the central table where a wealthy couple was sipping red wine. Flashing a radiant smile and using her sweetest voice, she leaned in slightly. "Would you care for another bottle of Margaux 2015? It pairs perfectly with the main course." The couple nodded, and Emma quickly jotted down the order, throwing in a few playful remarks to extend the conversation. But her eyes kept darting toward Michael's table, where he sat calmly, seemingly oblivious to her deliberate neglect. Emma walked past his table repeatedly, feigning busyness, balancing a tray in one hand and focusing on another table, acting as though she hadn't even noticed him. The steady clack of her heels on the wooden floor echoed her indifference. Michael, a man who had faced fierce competitors on the basketball court, refused to let her behavior affect his mood. Michael remained utterly composed, his large hands resting lightly on the table, his eyes wandering around the room with an air of quiet curiosity. A small jazz band played in the far corner of the restaurant, their gentle tunes filling the space with a soothing atmosphere. When the song ended, Michael clapped, a warm, resonant sound that brought smiles to the band members' faces. His applause not only caught the band's attention but also piqued the curiosity of nearby diners. Some began to wonder how he remained so calm even when it was clear he was being treated unfairly. Michael remained utterly composed, his large hands resting lightly on the table, his eyes wandering around the room with an air of quiet curiosity. A small jazz band played in the far corner of the restaurant, their gentle tunes filling the space with a soothing atmosphere. When the song ended, Michael clapped, a warm, resonant sound that brought smiles to the band members' faces. His applause not only caught the band's attention but also piqued the curiosity of nearby diners. Some began to wonder how he remained so calm even when it was clear he was being treated unfairly. At the counter, Emma frowned. The polite smile she wore for other customers had vanished. Michael's composure irritated her far more than she had anticipated. Inwardly, she began to suspect that he was challenging her on purpose. Why doesn't he say anything? No complaints, no demands for service, she thought, biting her lip in frustration. Determined to test Michael's patience further, Emma decided to delay things even more. She approached another table where a group of diners had just arrived and began an overly detailed explanation of the menu, fully aware that this would prolong Michael's wait. At another table, Mr. and Mrs. Carter, who had been watching the situation unfold, grew increasingly uneasy. Mrs. Carter leaned toward her husband and whispered, "Do you see what she's doing? She's obviously giving him a hard time. He's been waiting for at least 20 minutes. Mr. Carter sipped his wine, his sharp eyes fixed on Emma. "I see it, but what's intriguing is that he doesn't seem bothered. He's waiting but not for the food. I think he's waiting for something else." Michael remained seated, occasionally glancing at the paintings on the walls or the sparkling chandelier overhead. His unshakable calmness not only heightened Emma's frustration but also highlighted the pettiness in her behavior. As Emma walked past Michael's table yet again, she deliberately turned her back and spoke loudly enough for a colleague to hear. "Sometimes I think certain people don't understand that not everyone belongs here. It's amusing to watch how hard they try to fit in." Although her words weren't directly addressed to him, their target was clear. A few diners began whispering among themselves, some visibly disapproving but unwilling to intervene. At another table, Lisa, who had been observing the entire situation, couldn't hide her anger. Setting her wine glass down, she said to her friend, "She's awful. I don't understand why this restaurant keeps someone like her on staff." Her friend nodded, looking thoughtful. "But look at him. He doesn't need anyone to stand up for him. He knows exactly what he's doing." The prolonged wait turned into a tense performance, with Michael's calm demeanor and confidence making him the undisputed lead actor. Yet it was this very composure that exposed Emma's unprofessionalism and small-mindedness, a realization she had yet to come to terms with. The atmosphere inside La Lumiere restaurant grew increasingly tense, not because of any loud commotion, but due to the unusual silence surrounding Michael. He remained seated at a corner table near the kitchen, his demeanor calm, while Emma continued to blatantly ignore him. Her unprofessional behavior and rude attitude were no longer the secret they had discovered had captured the attention of many diners at the central table. Mr. Carter leaned slightly forward, his voice low but laced with indignation. "She's incredibly rude," he remarked, his eyes fixed on Emma, who was laughing and chatting with another group of diners. Mrs. Carter, who had been observing everything from the start, nodded subtly, her face showing clear displeasure. "I've never seen a staff member behave like this. She's clearly trying to humiliate him. We should report her to the manager." Mr. Carter set his wine glass down, his expression composed yet resolute. "I agree, someone like her shouldn't be working in a place like this. But let's wait and see how this unfolds." In another corner of the restaurant, Lisa, a young entrepreneur with a neatly cropped haircut, could no longer remain silent. She shook her head, her eyes filled with disapproval as she glanced toward Emma. Lisa had noticed the unfair treatment from the moment Michael walked in, and Emma's actions only fueled her indignation. "She's terrible," Lisa said to her companion, a man intently following the situation. "I can't believe a high-end restaurant like this would tolerate behavior like that." The man furrowed his brow thoughtfully. "Maybe because he hasn't said anything they think he's easy to overlook, but I have a feeling he's waiting for the right moment." Lisa tilted her head, curiosity in her gaze as she looked toward Michael, who sat upright, his face serene. "He seems so confident, but I hope the manager intervenes soon. Letting this drag on is just too unfair." Nearby, an elderly woman, Mrs. Hamilton, sat quietly with her. Mrs. Hamilton, observing the entire scene, sipped her tea and placed the cup down with a soft clink. "This is disgraceful," she said, her voice soft but weighty. "Staff are here to serve, not to judge the customers. That young woman needs to learn a lesson." Her granddaughter, a bright-eyed young woman, leaned forward. "Do you think he's going to do anything? He's just sitting there, not saying a word." "His silence is the answer," Mrs. Hamilton replied, her tone calm. "People who truly know their worth don't need to prove it to anyone. He knows who he is, and that girl will ruin herself soon enough." Meanwhile, Emma, oblivious to the simmering discontent spreading through the room, continued to focus on her personal agenda. She spent extra time at the central tables, deliberately engaging in lengthy conversations to divert attention from what she believed might spotlight Michael. Passing by Michael's table once again, she didn't even glance his way but spoke loudly enough to be heard as she conversed with a colleague. "This is why we need higher standards. Not everyone understands the sophistication required here, and clearly not everyone belongs." Michael's steady gaze glanced briefly at Emma without saying a word. He didn't need to respond, there was no need to react to someone so determined to dig their own hole. Instead, he offered a faint smile and continued observing the room, where other diners had started to murmur amongst themselves. At the central table, Mr. Carter turned back to Mrs. Carter, his voice low but firm. "We need to speak to the manager immediately. This isn't just unfair, it's ruining the atmosphere for everyone." Under the warm glow of the ornate chandeliers, the tension inside the Meridian had shifted from its signature elegance to something taut and electrifying, like a string pulled to its breaking point, waiting for the slightest touch to snap. After serving other tables and deliberately ignoring the guest she deemed unworthy, Emily, the self-assured waitress, finally made her way to the corner of the room where Michael Reed was seated. In her hand was a silver tray holding the filet mignon rossini, the restaurant's signature dish, priced at $350. Emily walked slowly, each deliberate step accompanied by the sharp click of her heels against the wooden floor, drawing the attention of every diner in the room. Her eyes gleamed with arrogance, and her every movement seemed to declare that this was nothing more than a begrudging service on her part. When she reached Michael's table, Emily paused for a moment, then placed the plate down with more force than necessary. The faint clink of the plate meeting the table echoed in the air, briefly breaking the silence. Her smile was cold and filled with challenge. "This is what you ordered. I hope you enjoy it," Emily said, her voice dripping with thinly veiled sarcasm. Michael, as usual, maintained his polite and composed demeanor. He glanced down at the intricately plated dish before him, then looked up slowly. There was no hint of anger or annoyance on his face. Michael's calmness didn't just reflect his confidence. It also stirred admiration and a quiet sense of indignation from those around him. Then Michael looked up at Emily, his warm and courteous tone cutting through the tension. "It looks delicious." "Thank you," he said, as if completely unaffected by the challenge in her words. But Emily wasn't ready to let the moment end. She leaned in slightly, her demeanor teetering between friendliness and condescension, her voice low yet sharp enough for him to hear. "This dish is for connoisseurs. I'm guessing it's your first time," she said, her words laced with subtle bitterness. Michael met her gaze, his calm eyes unwavering. There was no anger, no irritation, only a faint smile. "Thank you for the advice," he replied, his tone steady and composed. His calm reaction left Emily unsettled, her attempt to belittle him falling flat. Instead of embarrassing Michael, she inadvertently highlighted her own small-mindedness. At a nearby table, Lisa could no longer hold back. She leaned toward her friend, her voice filled with indignation. He just politely thanked her and she's still being sarcastic. Unbelievable. Her friend nodded, his eyes fixed on Michael. "She's trying to provoke him, but I think she chose the wrong person for that." At the center table, Mr. and Mrs. Carter observed the scene with serious expressions. Mr. Carter lifted his wineglass but didn't drink, his sharp eyes following Emily's every move. "She has no idea who she's dealing with," he murmured to his wife, his voice low but firm. "A man like that doesn't need to say or do anything. She'll end up embarrassing herself." Emily, oblivious to the judgmental glances from the other diners, straightened up and scanned Michael one more time, searching for any hint of discomfort or annoyance but finding none. A faint sense of defeat crept in, but she masked it with another smug remark. "If this doesn't suit your taste, we always have simpler options. Feel free to order if needed," she said with a false smile. Michael, his steady smile still in place, nodded lightly. "Thank you. I'll consider it," he replied. His unshakable composure seemed to irritate Emily even further. She clenched her notebook tightly, turned on her heel, and walked away without a backward glance. At the counter, she slammed the silver tray down, startling her colleague Jake. "He's just pretending to be polite," Emily hissed, her frustration dripping from every word. "I'm sure he doesn't even know what he just ordered. People like that only come here for attention." Jake frowned, his disapproval evident. "Maybe he just wants a peaceful dinner." "Isn't it our job to serve everyone?" he asked. Emily spun around, her eyes flashing with disdain. "Can't you see Jake? He doesn't belong here. I bet he'll leave as soon as he sees the bill." Meanwhile, Michael began to savor his filet mignon rossini. The tender slices of beef, paired with foie gras and truffle sauce, were a masterpiece of both flavor and presentation. He ate slowly, unhurried, his expression serene. Around him, murmurs from the other diners grew louder. Some expressed quiet indignation on his behalf, while others glanced at Emily with disapproving eyes. Though no one spoke out loud, the atmosphere of the restaurant shifted, from formal elegance to an uneasy tension. Sitting in the most inconspicuous corner of the Meridian, Michael had unexpectedly become the center of attention. Yet, he did nothing but enjoy his meal with calm grace, as if orchestrating the entire scene with his unshakable demeanor. Emily, completely unaware, was drawing closer to a lesson she would never forget. Michael's serene expression remained unchanged as the murmurs of the other diners grew louder around him. Some whispered their indignation on his behalf, while others cast disapproving glances at Emily. No one spoke openly, yet the atmosphere in the Meridian had shifted noticeably, from its typical formal elegance to an uneasy tension. Seated in the most inconspicuous corner, Michael had unexpectedly become the focal point of the entire restaurant. However, he did nothing but eat his meal calmly and gracefully, as though he were silently orchestrating the scene around him. Emily, unaware of the growing storm, turned away from Michael's table with a self-satisfied smile. She believed she was firmly in control, confident that her delays and sharp remarks would ultimately drive Michael to leave in quiet humiliation. But just moments later, the atmosphere shifted so drastically that her illusion of control began to crumble. From the reception desk, the restaurant manager, Mr. Thompson, appeared. A middle-aged man with a polished demeanor, he moved briskly toward Michael's table, his face etched with visible concern. His sudden presence drew the attention of nearby diners, who turned their curious gazes toward the far corner of the restaurant. When Mr. Thompson reached Michael's table, he bowed slightly, his voice low and filled with respect. "Mr. Reed, it's such an honor to have you here. I sincerely apologize for the delay, we had no idea you would be joining us this evening." His words were like a thunderclap, shattering the room's equilibrium. The soft murmurs of conversation ceased abruptly, replaced by a stunned silence. Patrons who had been idly watching now widened their eyes in disbelief at what they had just heard. Michael, still composed, set his knife and fork down gently. He looked up at Mr. Thompson with a warm smile, his voice smooth and kind. "It's no problem. I just wanted to enjoy a quiet dinner," he said simply. Across the room, Emily froze, her tray still in hand. Her vacant eyes locked onto the interaction between Mr. Thompson and Michael. The words echoed in her mind, tearing apart her earlier confidence. "Mr. Reed? Did he just call him Michael Reed?" The name swirled in her head as she struggled to accept the reality unfolding before her. As Emily glanced around, she noticed that every pair of eyes in the restaurant was now fixed on Michael, and to her horror, on her as well. A young couple seated nearby whispered, their voices just loud enough for Emily to catch. "That's Michael Reed, the philanthropist and business mogul," one said, excitement in their tone. "He's a major investor in multiple industries," added the other. "How could the staff here not recognize him?" The whispers spread like wildfire, rippling through the restaurant. Faces that had been merely curious moments ago now reflected admiration and astonishment. A few diners glanced at Emily, their expressions heavy with judgment. Emily's heart raced, panic and shame crashing over her in waves. She stood rooted to the spot, unable to move forward or retreat. Her face drained of color, and her trembling hands gripped the edge of the tray as if clinging to the last fragments of her composure. Mr. Thompson turned briefly, casting a sharp and stern glance in Emily's direction. He clearly sensed the unease radiating from the surrounding diners. Meanwhile, Michael remained seated, picking up his glass of water and turning his calm, piercing gaze toward Emily. His expression wasn't angry, but it carried a quiet authority that made her want to vanish. She knew without a doubt that her behavior had been fully exposed. The tension in the room thickened, and at the central table Mr. and Mrs. Carter exchanged a knowing glance, equal parts astonishment and satisfaction. Mr. Carter set down his wine glass and murmured, "I knew it. He doesn't need to say a word. His presence alone speaks volumes." From a nearby table, Lisa shook her head, her eyes filled with disappointment as they settled on Emily. "She's ruined herself," Lisa whispered. "A server who doesn't respect her guests has no place here." Michael set his glass down and spoke softly to Mr. Thompson. "You don't need to worry, everything's fine. But perhaps I'd like to have a brief chat with your team after dinner." Mr. Thompson immediately nodded, his expression shifting from worried to resolute. "Of course, Mr. Reed. I'll arrange it right away." Emily felt as though the ground beneath her feet was giving way. Michael's words, though gentle, carried undeniable weight. Every pair of eyes in the room remained fixed on her, their silent condemnation unbearable. What Emily had envisioned as her triumphant lesson to humble a supposed unworthy guest had now become the most humbling moment of her career. Frozen in place, she felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. The murmurs around her and the heavy silence emanating from Michael left her drowning in regret and self-awareness. There was no escape from the situation she had so carelessly created for herself. The stares of the patrons and the oppressive silence in the dining room left Emily paralyzed, unsure of how to proceed. A tide of confusion and fear surged within her, but there was no escaping the mess she had created. Michael, sitting calmly, placed his glass of water on the table and locked his steady gaze on her. His eyes held no anger, but the quiet firmness in them made her feel completely exposed. Leaning forward slightly, his deep, measured voice carried an undeniable authority. "Miss Emily," he said, "what do you think about how customers should be treated?" Emily opened her mouth to answer, but the words wouldn't come. She stammered, her thoughts crumbling under the weight of the moment. I didn't know who you were," she finally managed to say, her voice faltering. Michael shook his head slowly, his brows furrowing just enough to convey his disappointment. When he spoke, his voice rang out clearly, each word cutting through the tense atmosphere. You don't need to know who I am to treat me with respect. Every person who walks through these doors deserves to be treated with dignity. His words echoed in the room like a bell, sharp and clear, awakening a sense of clarity not only in Emily but in everyone present. A few diners nodded in agreement, while others exchanged hushed whispers. It was clear that Michael's words weren't just for Emily, they were for all of them. Emily felt her legs grow weak. She tried to find a response, but every word she thought of seemed stuck in her throat. Finally she whispered, her voice barely audible, "But, you're not like other customers." Michael leaned back in his chair, his gaze unwavering but no longer stern. His voice softened, yet each word carried undeniable weight. "It's precisely because I'm not like other customers that you need to learn to treat everyone the same. Respect isn't something you reserve for people based on how they dress, how they speak, or how they look. It's the most fundamental thing every person deserves." Emily lowered her head, gripping the edge of her tray so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She couldn't argue, couldn't defend herself. Every word and action from earlier that evening replayed in her mind like a haunting echo of her own mistakes. At a nearby table, Mr. Carter leaned toward his wife, his voice low but thoughtful. He doesn't need to raise his voice or assert himself. The way he's speaking is enough to teach her a lesson. Across the room, Lisa, a young professional seated with her friend, lifted her wine glass but didn't drink. Her gaze rested on Emily, her disappointment evident. "She'll remember this lesson for the rest of her life," she murmured. "At least I hope she does." The restaurant manager, Mr. Thompson, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally stepped forward. His voice was calm but firm. "Emily, we'll need to have a conversation after your shift. But for now, let me handle this situation." Emily didn't respond, only nodded faintly. Her eyes avoided everyone's and she stepped back, her face flushed with shame and fear. Michael watched her retreat for a moment before turning to Mr. Thompson. His tone softened. "There's no need to turn this into something bigger than it already is. I believe everyone can learn from their mistakes as long as they're willing to change." His words weren't just directed at Emily, they resonated throughout the restaurant. Some diners bowed their heads in quiet reflection, while others nodded in acknowledgement of the truth in his statement. Michael then calmly resumed his meal, his actions carrying an air of peaceful resolve, as though nothing had happened. But everyone in the restaurant knew that his calm was not indifference. It was the calm of someone who had delivered a profound lesson, one they wouldn't soon forget. From across the room, Emily could still feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her. She knew that her actions tonight wouldn't simply fade away. This was a turning point, not just in her career but in how she understood people and the responsibility she carried. When Michael finished his meal, he carefully set down his knife and fork, dabbed his mouth with a napkin and slowly rose to his feet. The room seemed to freeze in time. Every pair of eyes, from the diners at their tables to the staff standing nearby, turned toward him. No one dared to speak. The stillness was broken only by the faint murmur of distant conversations and the soft clinking of wine glasses. Michael's gaze swept across the room, his face calm but commanding. His piercing eyes radiated confidence and solemnity. When he finally spoke, his deep, resonant voice carried a weight that seemed to ripple through every corner of the restaurant. This restaurant was founded on the principle of welcoming everyone, no matter how they look or where they come from. That has always been the philosophy of its founders, myself included, Michael began, his calm, steady voice filling the room. His gaze moved deliberately from one face to another, ensuring his words resonated deeply with everyone present. After a pause, he continued, "Unfortunately, today we failed to uphold that belief." The words struck like a bell, reverberating through the restaurant and awakening a collective sense of accountability. The tension in the room grew heavier. Some diners lowered their heads, guilt evident in their expressions for remaining silent and doing nothing. Others nodded subtly, their faces tinged with embarrassment. At the center table, Mr. Carter gently set down his wine glass and shook his head. "It's shameful," he murmured to his wife. "He's right. We let this happen without saying a word." Nearby, Lisa leaned forward, admiration glistening in her eyes. "He's not just addressing the staff," she said softly. "He's speaking to all of us." Michael continued, his voice steady but laced with profound sincerity. "The world we live in is riddled with prejudice. We judge people by their appearance, the clothes they wear, the way they speak, or by what we assume they have, or don't have. But places like the Meridian must be different. This shouldn't just be a space for the wealthy or powerful. It must be a place where everyone feels welcome. His gaze shifted to Emily, but it wasn't an accusatory look. It was one of encouragement. We all make mistakes, he said, his tone softening slightly. What matters is what we learn from them. Emily, standing silently in the far corner, lowered her head further. Michael's words illuminated every misstep she had made that evening like a spotlight. There was no excuse that could justify her actions. The weight of every gaze on her shoulders was a constant reminder of her responsibility. Turning to the restaurant staff, Michael's tone softened but carried an unshakable resolve. This restaurant is not just a place to eat. It's a space where people come to feel valued and respected. If we forget that, we don't just fail ourselves, we fail the customers who trust us to be better. Some of the staff bowed their heads in shame, their regret palpable. Jake, a fellow server who had quietly witnessed everything, nodded slightly, his expression now reflecting newfound respect for Michael. Michael's gaze then shifted to the diners, his voice growing stronger. This isn't just about the staff, it's about all of us. We all have a responsibility to create a better space. When you see someone being treated unfairly, you have the right, and the responsibility, to speak up. Silence sometimes is complicity. His words rippled through the room, touching every heart. Some diners bowed their heads, ashamed of their silence, while others looked up at him with admiration. Unable to contain herself, Lisa began clapping softly. Her applause was like a spark, and within seconds the entire room joined in. Mr. Carter nodded in agreement and added his own applause, a satisfied smile spreading across his face. Michael raised his hand gently, signaling for silence. He turned to Mr. Thompson, the restaurant manager, who stood nearby, his expression a mix of worry and gratitude. I believe we can do better, Michael said, his voice now calm yet resolute. I'd like to meet with the entire staff after closing tonight. It's time for change. Mr. Thompson nodded, his voice filled with respect. Of course, Michael. I'm sorry for what happened tonight. We'll make it right. Michael sat back down and resumed his meal as though his powerful speech, which had left the entire restaurant in thoughtful silence, was nothing extraordinary. Yet it was clear no one in the room would forget the lesson he had delivered. In the corner, Emily felt the weight of her shame pressing on her shoulders. Yet beneath the embarrassment, a new resolve began to form, a determination to change, to become better, not just for her job but for herself. When the last diner left, the Meridian sank into a rare stillness. The staff gathered in the main dining space, forming a circle around Michael, who stood at the center with a calm yet commanding presence. The light from the chandelier above reflected off his face, highlighting the sincerity in his gaze. Michael scanned the group, his eyes moving from Mr. Thompson to each member of the staff, including Emily, who stood at the edge of the circle with her head bowed, avoiding his gaze. His deep, steady voice broke the silence. Everyone makes mistakes, but what matters is what we learn from them. Mistakes don't define us, how we correct them does. He paused, letting his words sink in. A few staff members nodded slightly, recognizing that his words were not only for Emily but for everyone. This restaurant is not defined by fancy tables or expensive dishes, he continued, his eyes sweeping across the room. It's defined by people, by how we treat each other and our guests. If we don't do that with respect and compassion, then nothing else matters. Emily, standing at the far end of the circle, felt his words strike her directly in the heart. Her eyes began to glisten with tears as she bit her lip, struggling to keep herself composed. She knew she couldn't avoid this moment forever. Michael's gaze finally settled on Emily. There was no anger or disdain in his expression, only sternness tempered with trust. Emily, he said, his voice softening but still firm, today has been a tough day, not just for you but for everyone here. But I want to hear from you. What do you think we should do to ensure this doesn't happen again? Emily looked up, her eyes red and watery. She took a deep breath, the weight of every gaze in the room heavy upon her. Her voice trembled as she spoke. I'm sorry, Michael. I was wrong. I let my own biases blind me and I failed in my responsibilities. I truly regret it. She paused to take another deep breath, tears streaming down her cheeks. I didn't realize that respect isn't about how someone looks. I understand that now and I promise I'll change. Michael nodded slightly, his eyes reflecting a mixture of gentleness and encouragement. That change is for you, Emily, not for me or anyone else. Change is a process and I believe you can do it if you truly want to. His words weren't just for Emily, they resonated with everyone in the room. A few staff members nodded subtly, acknowledging that they too needed to reflect on their own perspectives and actions. Michael took a step toward the center of the circle, his voice dropping lower but becoming even more resolute. This restaurant isn't defined by its decor or its menu. It's defined by the people in it. And if we don't treat each other and our guests with respect and compassion, nothing else matters. The room fell silent once more, save for the sound of soft breathing. Mr. Thompson, standing beside Michael, finally spoke up, his voice full of gratitude. "Michael, thank you for your words. We'll make sure our team not only learns from this mistake but truly changes, so that the Meridian becomes a place where everyone feels welcome." Michael nodded, his eyes showing a hint of relief. He looked around the room one last time before concluding, "Now is the time to start fresh, stronger and better. I believe you all can do it." Emily wiped away her tears, feeling as though a heavy burden had been lifted from her shoulders. At the same time, she felt the weight of a new responsibility, a commitment to change not just in her work but in herself. Michael had been given a new opportunity to make things right. In his gaze, Emily saw no resentment, only a glimmer of hope, and that made her all the more determined to change. That night, as everyone left the restaurant, not only Emily but the entire team at the Meridian realized that this wasn't just a lesson for their work. It was a profound lesson about how to be better human beings. The glass door of the Meridian gently closed behind Michael, leaving the elegant space behind. As the lights inside dimmed, the brilliant glow of the Beverly Hills streetlights illuminated his towering figure, highlighting each deliberate yet graceful step he took along the sidewalk. The stillness of the late night enveloped the surroundings, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves and the distant hum of passing cars. Michael walked slowly, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, while his mind lingered on the events of the evening. He thought about the restaurant, about Emily, the staff, and the diners who had witnessed tonight's moment. This wasn't just a lesson for one person, it was a lesson for everyone, including himself. Michael took a deep breath, a faint smile curling on his lips. A thought echoed powerfully in his mind, as clear as the words he had spoken earlier: "The world needs more kindness." True strength isn't in judgment but in acceptance. It's the small daily choices that define who we are. He thought of Emily, who had made a mistake but showed genuine remorse and a commitment to change. To him, that was far more meaningful than any reprimand or punishment could ever be. Memories of his time on the basketball court suddenly came rushing back. He recalled facing criticism and the hasty judgments people made about him, simply because of his playing style. He remembered how patience and calmness had helped him rise above it all. And tonight he saw a similar moment, not on the court but in a restaurant. As Michael rounded a corner, the glow of a neon sign reflected on his face, accentuating his confident and composed demeanor. He knew that his actions tonight weren't about showcasing power or proving anything. They were about planting a seed for change. A change not just within the Meridian but in the way people treat each other in the wider world. He paused for a moment, turning to look back at the Meridian, now dimly lit from its windows. He hoped that tonight's events wouldn't fade into obscurity but remain a lasting lesson for Emily, the staff, and the diners who had witnessed it. Kindness, he thought, isn't about grand gestures. It's about small, consistent choices made every day. When you choose to treat someone well, you don't just change them, you change yourself. Michael continued walking, leaving behind the sparkling lights of Beverly Hills. The road ahead stretched endlessly, much like the message he had imparted tonight. A path leading to a world where respect and compassion aren't luxuries but norms. The Meridian was no longer just a restaurant. It had become a symbol of hope, change, and the power of healing through the smallest acts of kindness. The story of the Meridian wasn't just about a dinner. It was a profound lesson in respect and compassion, two values that should never be constrained by appearances or status. Michael showed us that sometimes, calmness and kindness can be the most powerful tools to challenge and change what seems unchangeable. What do you think about tonight's lesson? Have you ever witnessed or experienced a similar situation where kindness and understanding shattered prejudice? Share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like it, share it to spread the message, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss out on more meaningful stories. See you in the next video. Thank you for listening to the entire story and message on the Soul Deep Stories YouTube channel. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to the channel, like and share this video to hear more amazing videos in the future.